Welcome to my notes snippet for topic 6.3, Indigenous Responses to State Expansion. In this topic, you'll see how nationalist movements emerged in response to European imperialism in South America, Africa, and Asia. Leaders of these movements had European-style educations and a deep understanding of Enlightenment ideals such as natural rights, sovereignty, and nationalism. Some colonial elites used their education to drive out their conquerors in the 20th century, resulting in the creation of new states. These are the developments listed in the College Board's curriculum. The rise of nationalism and questioning of political authority led to anti-colonial movements, which took different forms such as direct resistance and the creation of new states. Rebellions against imperial rule were fueled by growing discontent, and some were influenced by religious beliefs. Important people. The Cherokee Nation is a Native American tribe that assimilated to white settler culture, adopting colonial methods of farming, weaving, and building. Tupac Amaru II was a hereditary chief in southern Peru who was descended from the last Inca ruler. He led the last general Indian revolt against Spain in 1780, which spread throughout southern Peru and into Bolivia and Argentina before he and his family were captured in March 1781. Sepoys were Indian soldiers under British employ who made up the majority of the British armed forces in colonial India in the mid-19th century. They were mostly Hindus or Muslims, and their violent uprising against the British, known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857 or the Sepoy Mutiny, marked the emergence of Indian nationalism. José Rizal was a young Filipino man who started a reform movement called the Philippine League in 1892. He was arrested and executed by the Spanish, an action that shocked many Filipinos. Usman Dan Fodio was a Muslim intellectual who led a group of followers to purify Islam among the Hausa tribes of West Africa in the 18th century, creating a caliphate with its seat at the new town of Sokoto. Samori Touré was a West African king who fought against French colonial rule in the late 19th century. Muhammad Ahmad was a Sudanese religious leader who proclaimed himself the Mahdi, a prophesied redeemer of Islam who will appear before the day of judgment and rid the world of evil, and led a successful revolt against Egyptian and British forces in Sudan in the late 19th century. Ya Asante-Wa was an Ashanti queen mother who led a rebellion against British colonialism in Ghana, then known as the Gold Coast, in 1900. Shaka Zulu was a powerful Zulu king who expanded his kingdom through military conquests and reorganized his army into a formidable fighting force in the early 19th century. Important terms. The Indian National Congress was a political party founded in 1885 that aimed to represent the interests of Indians under British colonial rule and eventually played a key role in India's independence movement. The Ghost Dance was a religious movement among Native Americans in the late 19th century that promised the return of their traditional way of life and the disappearance of white settlers, but was violently suppressed by the U.S. government. Pan-Africanism is a political and social movement that seeks to unite people of African descent worldwide and promote their common interests, including ending colonialism, racism, and economic exploitation. The Xhosa cattle-killing movement was a movement among the Xhosa people of South Africa in the mid-19th century that led to the destruction of their cattle and crops, resulting in widespread famine and death, as they believed it would lead to liberation from British colonial rule. Aboriginal refers to the indigenous peoples of Australia, who have inhabited the continent for tens of thousands of years and have faced dispossession, discrimination, and cultural suppression under European colonization. Resistance and rebellions in the Americas. The Cherokee Nation assimilated to white settler culture by adopting colonial methods of farming, weaving, and building, and developing a syllabic alphabet for writing their language. However, despite their efforts to assimilate, the Cherokee faced removal and displacement from their ancestral lands due to the discovery of gold on their land in Georgia. This led to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced the Cherokee and other Southeast Native American tribes to relocate to what is now Oklahoma. The Ghost Dance movement was a religious movement among Native American tribes in the late 19th century that aimed to drive out whites and restore native lands. The movement involved dances and songs that were believed to hasten the return of the dead and the restoration of traditional ways of life. However, the movement ended tragically with the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of Sioux men, women, and children who were participating in the Ghost Dance. Tupac Amaru II was a leader of the last Inca revolt against Spanish colonial rule in Peru in the late 18th century. He led an indigenous rebellion against the Spanish authorities, but was eventually captured and executed along with his wife and sons. Resistance and rebellions in South Asia. The Sepoy Mutiny, also known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, was a violent uprising against British colonial rule in India. The rebellion emerged from Indian sepoys' outrage over the use of rifle cartridges that had been greased with a mixture of cow and pig fat. This was deeply offensive to both Hindu and Muslim sepoys, who viewed cows as sacred and pigs as unclean. They believed that the British were trying to convert them to Christianity by forcing them to use these cartridges. The sepoys' anger over this issue sparked a wider rebellion against British rule in India. Indian nationalism emerged as a response to British colonial rule over India, which began with the establishment of the British Raj in 1858. The Indian National Congress was established in 1885 by educated Indians who were frustrated with the lack of representation and political power under British rule. The Congress initially served as a forum for Indians to air their grievances to the colonial government, but it quickly evolved into a movement calling for self-rule and independence from British colonialism. The Indian National Congress played a key role in the Indian independence movement, which ultimately led to India's independence from British rule in 1947. Resistance and rebellions in Southeast Asia. Both Vietnam and the Philippines resisted colonization by European powers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Vietnam was colonized by France in the mid-19th century, and Vietnamese resistance to French colonialism began almost immediately. After World War II, Vietnam's struggle for independence continued against both French and American forces until Vietnam achieved independence in 1975. The Philippine resistance movement, led by figures such as José Rizal, fought against American colonial rule for several years before being defeated, but resistance to American colonialism continued throughout the early 20th century. The Spanish-American War was a conflict fought between Spain and the United States in 1898, primarily over the issue of Cuban independence. The U.S. emerged victorious and gained control of several Spanish colonies, including the Philippines. This led to the Philippine-American War, which lasted from 1899 to 1902 and was fought between Filipino revolutionaries and American forces seeking to establish colonial control over the Philippines. The war resulted in a U.S. victory and the establishment of American colonial rule over the Philippines until its independence in 1946. Resistance and rebellions in Australia and New Zealand. The Maori Wars were a series of conflicts that broke out in New Zealand in the mid-19th century between the indigenous Maori people and British colonial forces. The wars were sparked by British settlement patterns that threatened Maori property rights, as the British sought to acquire more land for their settlements. The Maori became alarmed by these developments and resisted British encroachment, leading to a series of armed conflicts that lasted for several decades. Resistance and rebellions in Africa. The Sokoto Caliphate was a large Islamic empire that existed in West Africa during the 19th century. It was founded by Usman Dan Fodio, a Muslim intellectual who sought to purify Islam among the Hausa tribes of the region. The Sokoto Caliphate became the largest African empire since the 16th century, but it was eventually subdued by the British in 1903 when they made it part of their colony of Nigeria. Samori Touré was a Mande chieftain who led a group of warriors to establish a powerful kingdom in Guinea during the late 19th century. He opposed French attempts to annex West Africa and fought against them in 1883. Although the French eventually succeeded, they offered Samori their protection. However, when he was unable to extend his kingdom to the east, he again went to war with the French in 1891. After his forces were ejected, he tried to re-establish his kingdom in the Upper Ivory Coast. The French finally captured him in 1898 and sent him into exile. Ya Asante-Wa was a powerful warrior queen who led the Asante Empire's rebellion against the British during the early 20th century, resulting in the deaths of 2,000 Asante and 1,000 British soldiers. Although it was the last African war led by a woman, it ended in September 1900 with a British victory. Ya Asante-Wa was exiled and Ashanti became part of the Gold Coast colony. In the mid-19th century, the British were fighting against the native Xhosa people in South Africa. In 1856 to 1857, some of the cattle of the local Xhosa were getting sick and dying, perhaps from diseases caught from the cattle of the British settlers. The Xhosa believed that killing their cattle and destroying their crops would cause spirits to remove the British settlers from their lands. As a result, they killed around 400,000 head of Xhosa cattle. However, this strategy ultimately failed to defeat the British, and they continued to rule over South Africa. The Zulu Kingdom, located on the South African coast of the Indian Ocean, was a well-organized and centralized state that put up a strong fight against the British during the Anglo-Zulu War in the 1870s. At first, this war went in favor of the Zulus, but eventually, the British defeated them. The lands of the Zulu Kingdom became part of the British colony of South Africa after their defeat. The Mahdiist Revolt was a political and religious movement in East Africa led by Sudanese Islamic cleric Muhammad Ahmad, who declared himself the Mahdi. The movement aimed to restore the glory of Islam and fight against Egyptian rule, which had fueled resentment among the Sudanese. By 1882, the Mahdiist army had taken control of Khartoum. However, a joint British-Egyptian military expedition launched a counterattack in 1883, which ultimately failed after Ahmad's death from typhus in June 1885. Pan-Africanism aimed to create a shared African identity and a unified front against colonialism by emphasizing the common history, culture, and destiny of all people of African descent. This movement played an important role in the struggle against colonialism in Africa by creating a sense of solidarity among Africans and providing a framework for political action. In a nutshell, nationalism emerged from anti-imperialist sentiments and took various forms of resistance. New states were created in opposition to imperial powers, there were rebellions and direct warfare against imperialists, and religious ideas motivated some resistance movements. I hope this snippet was useful. Visit mrb.world for more resources.